She sold herself for warmth and safety. But the Comanche put a feather on her hand and built her home, Texas Panhandle Territory. October 1867, the wind carved through the endless grassland like a blade made of ice and desperation, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the weight of broken dreams. Hannah Pierce stood at the edge of Fort Richardson, clutching a faded carpet bag that contained everything she owned in this world, which wasn't much more than 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, and $17 in crumpled bills. The fort buzzed with the controlled chaos of frontier military life, but beneath the surface, Hannah could sense the tension that had gripped this corner of Texas since the war's end. Confederate soldiers had returned home to find their farms burned, their families scattered, and their futures as uncertain as morning mist. Union forces maintained an uneasy peace, while reports of Comanche raids filtered in daily from the surrounding settlements. Hannah had been walking for 6 days since the stagecoach broke down outside Weatherford, sleeping under mesquite trees and drinking from muddy creek beds. The driver had taken one look at the broken axle and the approaching storm clouds before announcing that anyone who couldn't pay for repairs could find their own way to their destination. Hannah's $17 might as well have been 17 cents for all the good it would do her now. The other passengers had been wealthy enough to wait for rescue or hire private transportation, but Hannah was traveling on borrowed money and borrowed time. She'd sold her family's farm in Missouri after her husband died of fever, used most of the proceeds to pay off debts she hadn't known existed, and bought passage west with what remained. The promise of work as a schoolteacher in the growing town of Jacksboro had seemed like salvation 6 months ago. Now it felt like chasing smoke. Inside the fort's commissary, the warmth hit her like a physical blow after days in the cold wind. Soldiers lined up for their evening meal, their conversations a mixture of complaints about the food and speculation about Apache movements to the south. Hannah approached the counter where a thick-set sergeant was ladling stew into tin bowls. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sergeant looked up, taking in her travel-stained dress and hollow cheeks. "Ma'am, this is military mess. Civilians eat in town." "I don't have money for a meal in town," Hannah said, hating the way her voice cracked on the admission. The sergeant's expression softened slightly. "Where you headed, ma'am?" Jacksboro. I'm supposed to start teaching school there next week." "Jacksboro's been abandoned for 3 months now," the sergeant said gently. "Comanche burned it to the ground in July, killed half the folks, took the rest captive. I'm sorry, ma'am, but there ain't no school there no more." The words hit Hannah like physical blows. No school meant no job meant no future, and no future meant she was stranded in hostile territory with $17 and winter coming fast. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. "Is there anywhere else I might find work?" she asked desperately. The sergeant glanced around the mess hall, then leaned closer. "Look, ma'am, I ain't supposed to say this, but there's opportunities for women willing to work hard. The sutler's store needs someone to keep books and handle supplies. Pay ain't much, but it comes with room and board." Hannah felt a flicker of hope. "Where would I find the sutler?" Building next to the blacksmith shop. Tell Morrison that Sergeant Kelly sent you." "But ma'am," his voice dropped lower, "be careful what you agree to. Some of these frontier businessmen got ideas about what kind of work they expect from young women. If you catch my meaning." The sutler's store occupied a long wooden building that smelled of leather, tobacco, and something else Hannah couldn't quite identify. Shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from ammunition to sewing notions, while barrels of flour and salt pork sat in orderly rows down the center aisle. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s with graying hair and the soft look of someone who'd never missed many meals. "Mr. Morrison?" Hannah asked. He looked up from his ledger, his small eyes taking in her appearance with the practiced assessment of a man who dealt in commodities. "That's right. What can I do for you, young lady?" "Sergeant Kelly said you might have work available. I can read and write, I'm good with numbers, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Morrison set down his pen and walked around the counter, studying Hannah like a horse trader, evaluating breeding stock. "You got experience with bookkeeping?" Yes, sir. I helped my late husband with his farming accounts for 3 years. References." Hannah's heart sank. "The people who might vouch for me are back in Missouri. I was traveling to Jacksboro to teach school, but Jacksboro ain't there no more," Morrison finished. "Yeah, I heard about that mess. Comanche got real bold this summer. Been hitting settlements all up and down the frontier." He walked closer, and Hannah caught the smell she hadn't been able to identify earlier. Whiskey, mixed with something sour and unpleasant. "Tell you what, miss, I do need someone to help with the books and manage supplies. Job pays $20 a month plus room and board." $20 was more than Hannah had dared hope for. "That's very generous, Mr. Morrison. Course, the job involves more than just bookkeeping," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "Woman living alone on the frontier needs protection, needs someone to look after her interests. I'd be providing that service as well." Something in his manner made Hannah's skin crawl, but she was in no position to be particular about the terms of employment. "What sort of additional duties?" Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, nothing too demanding. Keeping house, cooking meals, providing companionship when business gets lonely. A woman's touch, you might say." The meaning was clear enough. Hannah felt sick, but what choice did she have? Winter was coming. She had no money, no prospects, and nowhere else to go. She thought of her husband's grave back in Missouri, of the promises she'd made to build a new life, of the dreams that had brought her this far only to die in a frontier sutler's store. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Morrison's expression hardened. "Nothing to think about, miss. This is the only offer you're likely to get in these parts. You can take it or you can try your luck with the Comanche. Winter's coming and I hear they treat their captives real good." Before Hannah could respond, shouts erupted from outside the store. Through the window, she saw soldiers running toward the fort's walls, their rifles glinting in the fading sunlight. Someone was yelling about riders approaching from the north. Morrison grabbed a rifle from behind the counter and moved toward the door. "Stay inside," he barked at Hannah. "Indians don't usually attack the fort directly, but you never know." Hannah pressed herself against the window, trying to see what was happening. In the distance, she could make out a line of horsemen moving across the prairie with fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. Even from this distance, there was something different about the way they rode, as if they and their horses were a single entity rather than separate beings. The fort's bugler sounded the alarm, and soldiers scrambled to defensive positions along the walls. But as the riders drew closer, Hannah realized this wasn't an attack. There were only about a dozen of them, and they approached under what appeared to be a white flag. "Parley!" someone shouted. "They want to talk." Hannah watched in fascination as the Comanche delegation rode up to the fort's main gate. She'd heard stories about the famous Comanche horsemen all her life, but seeing them in person was something entirely different. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of lifetimes spent in the saddle, their horses responding to subtle shifts in weight and pressure that were invisible to untrained eyes. The leader of the group was a man who appeared to be in his 30s, tall and lean with long black hair decorated with feathers and beads. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about his presence. The way he sat his horse with absolute confidence while scanning the fort's defenses with intelligent dark eyes. Behind him rode warriors of various ages, some barely more than boys, while others showed the weathered faces of men who'd seen many battles. Their weapons were a mixture of traditional bows and lances, alongside captured rifles and revolvers, evidence of their adaptation to changing times. Fort Richardson's commanding officer, Colonel Mackenzie, emerged from his headquarters building with a small escort of soldiers. Hannah watched the tense meeting unfold in the space between the fort's walls and the Comanche delegation. The conversation was conducted in a mixture of broken English, Spanish, and sign language, with both sides clearly struggling to communicate complex ideas across the cultural divide. From what Hannah could overhear, The Comanche were offering to return captured horses and mules in exchange for safe passage through the area to reach their winter camps. What struck Hannah most was the dignity of the Comanche leader. Despite being vastly outnumbered and surrounded by hostile forces, he negotiated with the calm confidence of a man discussing the weather. His followers remained motionless on their horses, hands resting casually on their weapons, but making no threatening gestures. "That's Nokoni Puha," she heard Morrison say behind her. He'd returned to the store but kept his rifle ready. Means wandering medicine in their tongue. He's one of their war chiefs, got a reputation for being smart and dangerous in equal measure. "He doesn't look dangerous," Hannah said, studying the Comanche leader's face. Morrison snorted. "Honey, that man has killed more white folks than you got fingers and toes. Don't let the peaceful act fool you. These savages would scalp us all given half a chance." But Hannah found herself disagreeing with Morrison's assessment. There was something in Nokoni Puha's manner that spoke of intelligence and honor rather than savage brutality. The way he controlled his horse with subtle movements, the patience he showed during the difficult negotiations, the respect his own warriors clearly held for him, these weren't the characteristics of a mindless killer. As the negotiations continued, Nokoni Puha's gaze swept across the fort's buildings and briefly met Hannah's eyes through the store window. For just an instant, their eyes locked across the cultural and physical divide that separated them. Hannah felt a strange jolt of recognition, as if she were looking into the eyes of someone she'd known her entire life. There was intelligence there and something else, a kind of sadness or weariness that she recognized from her own reflection in recent months. This was a man who'd seen too much loss, carried too many burdens, fought too many battles that solved nothing. Good. The moment passed quickly as Nokoni Puha returned his attention to the negotiations, but Hannah found herself continuing to watch him with new interest. She noticed the way he listened carefully to every word spoken, the subtle hand signals he used to communicate with his warriors, the respectful distance he maintained from the fort's representatives even while making his points clear. "Negotiations are breaking down," Morrison observed, watching Colonel Mackenzie's increasingly animated gestures. "Looks like the colonel doesn't trust their promises about safe passage." Indeed, Hannah could see tension rising on both sides. The soldiers were gripping their weapons more tightly, while the Comanche warriors had begun to shift restlessly in their saddles. What had started as a diplomatic meeting was rapidly approaching the edge of violence. Then something unexpected happened. A young Comanche warrior, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, suddenly wheeled his horse and began riding hard toward the south. Within seconds, 2 other warriors followed him, and suddenly the carefully controlled parley was dissolving into chaos. Colonel Mackenzie shouted orders, and a squad of cavalry burst from the fort's gates in pursuit of the fleeing Comanche. Nokoni Puha raised his voice in what sounded like angry commands, but the young warriors were already too far away to hear. The remaining Comanche delegation found themselves in an impossible position: stay and face accusations of bad faith, or flee and confirm the soldiers' suspicions about their intentions. Hannah watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. The pursuing cavalry was gaining ground on the fleeing warriors, while Nokoni Puha struggled to maintain order among his own men. Several of the Comanche were reaching for their weapons, clearly torn between loyalty to their leader and the instinct to protect their fleeing companions. "This is how massacres start," Hannah whispered to herself. She was right. Colonel Mackenzie was shouting for his men to prepare for battle, convinced that the Comanche had been planning treachery all along. The remaining warriors were forming a defensive circle around Nokoni Puha, their lances and rifles creating a bristling hedge of weapons. But then Nokoni Puha did something that surprised everyone. Instead of preparing for battle or attempting to flee, he dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the fort's gates, with his hands raised and empty. His warriors called out in alarm, but he ignored them. continuing his approach until he stood within easy rifle range of the soldiers on the walls. "I speak for peace," he called out in heavily accented English. "Young men make young mistakes. I stay. I answer for their actions." The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to what everyone expected from a Comanche war chief, that it stopped the escalating violence in its tracks. Colonel Mackenzie stared at the lone figure standing defenseless before his fort, clearly struggling to process this development. "You're offering yourself as hostage?" The colonel called down from the walls. "I offer my word," Nokoni Puha replied. "My word is my life. If young warriors do harm, my life pays the price." It was a brilliant piece of diplomacy, Hannah realized. By offering himself as collateral for his warriors' behavior, Nokoni Puha had simultaneously demonstrated good faith and placed the moral burden on the soldiers. Killing an unarmed hostage who'd voluntarily surrendered would be murder by any civilized standard, while the promise of his life ensured that his warriors would think twice before causing trouble. Colonel Mackenzie seemed to recognize the wisdom of the arrangement, even if it wasn't what he'd expected. "Very well. You'll be held under guard until your men return safely to their territory. Any hostile action by Comanche forces, and you'll be held responsible." "I understand," Nokoni Puha said simply. Hannah watched as soldiers emerged from the fort to escort the Comanche leader inside. As he passed the sutler's store, his eyes again met hers through the window. This time, she saw something new in his expression. Not sadness or weariness, but a kind of quiet acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. Morrison was practically bouncing with excitement beside her. "This is perfect," he said. "Having a Comanche hostage will bring every curious fool for 50 miles around to Gork. Business will be booming." But Hannah wasn't thinking about business opportunities. She was thinking about the courage it must have taken for Nokoni Puha to place himself at the mercy of his enemies, and about the kind of man who would risk his own life to prevent a massacre. Everything Morrison had told her about savage brutality seemed to crumble in the face of what she'd just witnessed. As the immediate excitement died down and the fort returned to its normal routine, Morrison turned his attention back to Hannah. "Well, miss, you've had time to think about my offer. What's your answer?" Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since entering his store. She saw the calculating gleam in his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on her body, the assumption of ownership already evident in his manner. Then she thought about Nokoni Puha's dignified surrender, his willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good, the respect his own warriors clearly held for him, despite the cultural stories she'd been told about savage leadership. "I need more time to consider," she said finally. Morrison's expression darkened. "I told you already, miss. This is the only opportunity you're going to get. Winter's coming, and you got no other options. You can work for me under the terms I've laid out, or you can try your luck elsewhere. But I guarantee you won't find better terms anywhere else on this frontier." He was right, Hannah knew. Her $17 wouldn't last a week, and there were no other jobs available for a woman alone in this dangerous territory. But something about witnessing Nokoni Puha's courage had awakened something in her own spirit. A refusal to simply surrender to circumstances without at least trying to find another way. "I understand your position, Mr. Morrison, but I still need time to think." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "Time to think? Lady, you're in no position to be particular about anything. You're broke, you're alone, and you're in the middle of hostile territory. I'm offering you shelter, food, and protection. All I'm asking in return is a little female companionship. That's a fair trade by any reasonable standard. And if I refuse?" Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Then you're welcome to try your luck with the Comanche. I hear they're always looking for new wives. Of course, they don't usually ask permission first." Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. She was trapped, with no good options and no way out. In the growing darkness outside the store, she could see lanterns being lit throughout the fort as soldiers settled in for another night on the dangerous frontier. Somewhere among those lights, Nokoni Puha was being held prisoner, a man who'd sacrificed his freedom to prevent bloodshed. "I'll give you my answer in the morning," she said. Morrison nodded curtly. "Fine, but don't expect me to wait much longer. A woman on her own out here won't last long once the snows start. Come morning, you'll see things more clearly." As Hannah left the store to find somewhere to spend what might be her last night of freedom, she couldn't stop thinking about the moment when Nokoni Puha's eyes had met hers. There had been something in that brief connection, a recognition that transcended the cultural barriers between them. She didn't know what it meant, but she sensed that her encounter with the Comanche war chief had changed something fundamental about her understanding of survival. Courage and the choices people made when faced with impossible circumstances. The wind picked up as she walked through the fort, carrying with it the promise of the harsh winter to come and the weight of decisions that would determine not just her immediate survival, but the kind of person she would become in the months and years ahead. Hannah spent the night huddled in the corner of the fort's chapel, wrapped in her thin traveling coat, while October wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls. The chaplain, a kind man named Father O'Sullivan, had offered her sanctuary for the evening after hearing her story from Sergeant Kelly. Sleep remained elusive as she wrestled with Morrison's ultimatum and the impossible choice between degradation and starvation. Around midnight, she heard footsteps approaching the chapel. Through the frosted window, she glimpsed two guards escorting a tall figure toward the makeshift prisoner quarters in the fort's administrative building. Even in the dim moonlight, she recognized Nokoni Puha's distinctive silhouette and the proud way he carried himself despite being in chains. Something about his dignified bearing in captivity stirred memories of her late husband's stories about honor during wartime. James had served briefly in the Confederate Army before illness sent him home, and he'd often spoken about soldiers who maintained their principles even when facing death. She'd thought such nobility was the province of storybooks and battlefield legends, but here was living proof that courage could transcend cultural boundaries. Father O'Sullivan found her sitting by the window at dawn, staring toward the building where Nokoni Puha was being held. The elderly priest moved stiffly in the morning cold, his breath visible in small puffs as he prepared for morning prayers. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked gently, settling beside her on the wooden bench. "I keep thinking about what I witnessed yesterday," Hannah admitted. "That Comanche leader, the way he surrendered himself to prevent bloodshed. I've been told all my life that Indians are savage and godless, but what he did seemed more Christian than anything I've seen from supposedly civilized men." Father O'Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "I've been ministering on this frontier for 12 years, child. I've seen atrocities committed by both sides that would make angels weep. But I've also seen acts of compassion and honor that transcend the boundaries we draw between ourselves and those we consider enemies." He gestured toward the prisoner quarters. "That man made a choice yesterday that potentially saved dozens of lives. In my theology, such self-sacrifice reflects the divine image present in all human souls, regardless of their cultural background." Hannah's philosophical reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Morrison and two of his associates at the chapel door. The sutler looked freshly shaved and well-fed, a stark contrast to Hannah's own disheveled appearance after her uncomfortable night. "Miss Pierce, I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my generous offer," Morrison said without preamble. "I've prepared the necessary paperwork for your employment, and I've cleared out living quarters in the back of my store." Behind Morrison stood two men Hannah hadn't seen before, a thin, nervous individual who constantly adjusted his spectacles, and a burly man with scarred knuckles who radiated casual menace. The message was clear. This wasn't really a negotiation anymore. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your offer, but I'm still exploring other possibilities," Hannah said. Trying to keep her voice steady, Morrison's expression hardened. "What other possibilities?" "There are no other employers within 100 miles who would hire a woman in your circumstances. The nearest settlement is 3 days' ride through hostile territory. Assuming you could afford transportation, which you cannot." He stepped closer, and Hannah caught the smell of whiskey on his breath, despite the early hour. "I'm being more than fair, offering legitimate employment with room and board. Many men in my position would simply take what they wanted without bothering with such niceties." The threat was unmistakable. Hannah glanced at Father O'Sullivan, hoping for support, but the priest's face showed the helpless frustration of a man who understood the harsh realities of frontier life better than he cared to admit. The church's moral authority carried little weight when confronted with economic desperation and physical force. "I need until this evening to make my final decision," Hannah said. Morrison consulted a pocket watch with theatrical precision. "Very well, but understand that my patience has limits. By sunset tonight, you'll either be working for me under my terms or you'll be facing the wilderness alone. Those are your only choices." After Morrison left, Father O'Sullivan placed a comforting hand on Hannah's shoulder. "I wish I could offer you sanctuary indefinitely, child, but the army contracts for my services don't extend to housing civilians. I'll pray for your guidance, but I fear your options are indeed limited." Hannah spent the morning walking the fort's perimeter, trying to clear her head and think of alternatives that didn't exist. Her aimless wandering brought her past the administrative building where Nokoni Puha was being held. Through a barred window, she could see him sitting cross-legged on the floor, his eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation or prayer. A young soldier named Private Davies was standing guard outside the building, looking bored and cold in the morning wind. Hannah recognized him from the mess hall where she'd first sought help. He'd been one of the few soldiers who'd nodded politely when she'd asked for directions. "Excuse me, Private," Hannah said softly. "How is the prisoner being treated?" Davies glanced around nervously before answering. "Well enough, I suppose. Colonel's orders are to keep him secure but comfortable. He gets the same rations as the soldiers, and the doc checked him over for injuries yesterday. Has he said anything? Made any requests?" "That's the strange thing, ma'am. Most prisoners either curse a blue streak or beg for mercy. This one just sits quiet, like real dignified, almost like he's a guest instead of a captive, if you catch my meaning." Hannah found herself drawn to the window, studying Nokoni Puha's face in the morning light. Even in captivity, there was something magnetic about his presence, an inner strength that seemed undiminished by his circumstances. His features were weathered by years of outdoor living, but his expression held intelligence and what she could only describe as nobility. As if sensing her scrutiny, Nokoni Puha opened his eyes and looked directly at her. For the second time in 2 days, their gazes locked across the cultural divide that separated their worlds. This time, however, the connection lasted longer, and Hannah felt an inexplicable sense of communication that transcended language barriers. "Ma'am, you probably shouldn't be staring at the prisoner like that," Private Davies said uncomfortably. "Colonel's orders are to minimize contact with civilians." But before Hannah could move away, Nokoni Puha rose gracefully to his feet and approached the window. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are the woman from yesterday," he said. "The one who watched from the trading post window?" Hannah nodded, surprised by his directness. "Yes, I saw what you did. How you offered yourself to prevent violence." Nokoni Puha studied her face with disconcerting intensity. "And now you face your own difficult choice." The statement was so unexpected that Hannah stepped backward. "How could you possibly know that?" "No, your eyes carry the same weight mine carried yesterday," he replied simply. "The look of someone deciding whether to surrender with honor or fight a battle they cannot win." Private Davies shifted nervously. "Ma'am, I really don't think you should be talking to the prisoner." But Hannah found herself unable to move away. There was something in Nokoni Puha's manner that suggested he understood her situation better than anyone else in the fort, despite the obvious differences in their circumstances. "What would you do?" she asked quietly. "If you were in my position?" Nokoni Puha considered the question seriously. "In my culture, we believe that every person possesses inner medicine, a spiritual strength that cannot be taken away by others, only surrendered by choice. Sometimes preserving that medicine requires accepting hardship in the present to maintain hope for the future." Hannah felt tears welling up in her eyes. But what if there is no future? What if the only choices are between different kinds of surrender? There are always more choices than enemies want us to see, Nokoni Puha replied. But finding them requires courage to look beyond the boundaries others have drawn around our lives. Private Davies was becoming increasingly agitated. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move along now. The colonel will have my hide if he finds out I let civilians chat with the prisoner. As Hannah reluctantly prepared to leave, Nokoni Puha called her name softly. Hannah Pierce. She turned, startled that he knew her name. How did you— Word travels quickly in a small fort, he said with the hint of a smile. Your situation is known to many, including those who wish they could help but find their hands tied by circumstance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something that caught the morning light. In my tribe we have a custom, he said, extending his hand toward the window. When someone faces a difficult journey, we offer them a talisman for protection and guidance. In his palm lay a single eagle feather, its edges trimmed with small beads and painted with symbols Hannah didn't recognize. Even through the window bars, she could see the intricate craftsmanship and feel the spiritual significance of the offering. I cannot accept that, Hannah whispered. It must be precious to you. Its value lies not in possession, but in purpose, Nokoni Puha replied. This feather has carried me through many battles and dark times. Now it seeks a new bearer who needs its medicine. Private Davies looked around frantically. This is really not allowed, ma'am. If the colonel sees— But Nokoni Puha had already slipped the feather through the window bars. Hannah found herself reaching out instinctively, her fingers closing around the sacred object. The moment she touched it, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her troubled spirit. Remember, Nokoni Puha said softly, you are stronger than your circumstances. Do not let others define the boundaries of your possible choices. Hannah spent the rest of the morning sitting by the fort's well, turning the eagle feather over in her hands and thinking about Nokoni Puha's words. The intricate beadwork and painted symbols seemed to tell a story she couldn't read, but somehow understood on an emotional level. Other residents of the fort gave her curious looks as they went about their daily business, but no one bothered her. Word had spread about her situation, and most people seemed to understand that she needed time to think through an impossible decision. Around midday, she was approached by Mrs. Catherine Brennan, the wife of Fort Richardson's quartermaster. The older woman had kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who'd spent years managing household logistics in challenging circumstances. My dear, I heard about your predicament from Father O'Sullivan, Mrs. Brennan said, settling beside Hannah on the wooden bench. I wish I could offer you employment myself, but my husband's salary barely stretches to support our own family. Usnun. I understand, Mrs. Brennan. Everyone's been very kind, but I know there aren't many opportunities for women in my situation. Mrs. Brennan studied the feather in Hannah's hands with obvious curiosity. That's beautiful workmanship. Where did you acquire such a thing? Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Someone gave it to me as a token of encouragement. Someone Indian, I'd guess, given the style of beadwork, Mrs. Brennan said matter-of-factly. My first husband traded with several tribes before the war, and I learned to recognize different tribal artistic traditions. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. I heard you've been speaking with the Comanche prisoner. That's caused quite a stir among the officers' wives, though I suspect most of them are more curious than scandalized. Hannah looked up in alarm. I hope I haven't caused any problems. Problems? My dear girl, half the women in this fort would give their eye teeth for a chance to satisfy their curiosity about our mysterious captive. The other half think you're either incredibly brave or completely foolish. Mrs. Brennan smiled warmly. For what it's worth, I fall into the brave category. Anyone who can look past cultural prejudices to recognize honor in an enemy shows more wisdom than most of our so-called leaders. The conversation with Mrs. Brennan gave Hannah a new perspective on her situation. She began to realize that her interaction with Nokoni Puha hadn't gone unnoticed, but the reactions were more complex than simple disapproval. Some fort residents seemed genuinely intrigued by her willingness to engage with the Comanche prisoner. That afternoon, she was approached by Dr. Samuel Richardson, the fort's medical officer, who'd apparently heard about her situation through the complex network of frontier gossip. "Miss Pierce, I wonder if I might have a word with you," Dr. Richardson said, removing his hat politely. "I understand you're facing some difficult decisions about your future employment." "That's true, Dr. Richardson. I also understand that you've had some interaction with our Comanche guest," he continued carefully. "That interests me professionally, as I've been tasked with monitoring his health and well-being during his stay with us." Hannah felt a flutter of concern. "Is he unwell?" Quite the contrary. He's in remarkable physical condition for a man his age, but I'm curious about his mental state, his attitude toward his captivity. He's been completely cooperative with my examinations, but he doesn't volunteer information about his thoughts or feelings." Dr. Richardson paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "However, I noticed a marked change in his demeanor after your conversation this morning. He seems more alert, more engaged with his surroundings. I'm wondering what you might have discussed that could account for such a shift." Hannah considered how much to reveal about their brief exchange. "We spoke about facing difficult choices with courage. He offered some philosophical thoughts about maintaining inner strength during hardship." "Fascinating," Dr. Richardson murmured. "That aligns with my observations about his character. Despite being our prisoner, he carries himself with remarkable dignity. It's quite different from what I expected based on the stories we hear about Comanche warriors." The doctor leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Miss Pierce, I'm going to share something with you that's not generally known around the fort. Colonel Mackenzie has been in communication with Indian agents about arranging a prisoner exchange. There's talk of releasing Nokoni Puha in return for several white captives currently held by his tribe." Hannah felt her heart skip. "When might this happen?" "Yeah, within the next few days, possibly sooner. The negotiations are delicate, but both sides seem motivated to reach an agreement." The news filled Hannah with an unexpected sense of loss. She'd only spoken with Nokoni Puha twice, but his words had provided more genuine guidance than anything she'd received from the supposedly civilized members of Fort society. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah became aware that Morrison was keeping watch on her movements around the fort. She spotted him or his associate several times, always at a distance, but clearly monitoring her activities. The message was unmistakable. Her time for independent decision-making was running out. Around 4 o'clock, Morrison himself approached her near the chapel, where she'd returned to think privately about her situation. "Miss Pierce, I trust you've used your additional time wisely," he said with false cheerfulness. "The sun will be setting in a few hours, and I need to know your decision." "Mr. Morrison, I've been thinking carefully about your offer, and I appreciate your patience." "I'm glad to hear that. Have you prepared your belongings?" "I've arranged for you to move into your new quarters this evening." Hannah felt the walls closing in around her. Morrison's confidence suggested that he viewed her acceptance as a foregone conclusion, and perhaps he was right. She had no money, no transportation, and no realistic alternatives. Winter was approaching, and survival required making compromises with unpleasant realities. "There's one more thing I need to consider," she said desperately. "I've heard there might be opportunities for employment, with families planning to establish new homesteads in the spring." Morrison's expression darkened. "Miss Pierce, I've been more than generous with my time and patience. But I'm a businessman, not a charity organization. If you're not prepared to accept my offer tonight, then I'll withdraw it permanently." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. And I'll make sure that everyone in this territory knows that you're a woman who can't be trusted to honor her agreements. Try finding employment anywhere on this frontier with that reputation. The threat was clear and effective. In a society where reputation was everything and opportunities for women were already severely limited, Morrison's influence could destroy any chance Hannah might have for legitimate employment. As sunset approached, Hannah found herself back at the window of Nokoni Puha's prison, drawn by the need to speak with someone who understood the weight of impossible choices. The eagle feather remained in her hand, its presence somehow comforting despite her growing despair. "You have reached the moment of decision," Nokoni Puha observed as she approached the window. Private Davies had been replaced by a different guard who seemed less concerned about civilian conversations. "I don't think I have any real choice," Hannah said quietly. "Morrison's offer is the only option available, regardless of what it might cost me." Nokoni Puha studied her face with the same intense attention he'd shown earlier. In battle, warriors sometimes believe they must choose between death and dishonor. But experienced fighters know that such moments often reveal hidden paths that were invisible before. "What do you mean?" When an enemy believes they have trapped you completely, they become careless about guarding against possibilities they cannot imagine. Hannah shook her head in frustration. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "Morrison controls all the economic opportunities in this area. I have no money, no connections, no way to survive independently." Nokoni Puha reached through the bars and gently touched the eagle feather in her hand. "This talisman carries the medicine of my people, but its power can only be awakened by courage. Are you prepared to trust in possibilities you cannot yet see?" Before Hannah could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Morrison appeared around the corner of the building, flanked by his 2 associates and carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained the employment contracts he expected her to sign. "Miss Pierce, the sun is setting," Morrison called out. "It's time to conclude our business arrangement." Hannah looked from Morrison to Nokoni Puha, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders. The eagle feather seemed to grow warm in her hand, and she remembered the Comanche leader's words about inner medicine that could not be taken away by others, only surrendered by choice. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. Hannah clutched the eagle feather tighter and looked directly at Morrison with newfound resolve burning in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I must respectfully decline your offer of employment." The words seemed to hang in the evening air like smoke from a rifle shot. Morrison's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold fury that made Hannah's blood run cold. His 2 associates stepped closer, their intentions clearly shifting from persuasion to intimidation. "I beg your pardon," Morrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Perhaps you didn't hear me clearly. This is your last opportunity for legitimate employment. Refuse now, and you'll find yourself facing the wilderness alone with winter approaching." "I heard you perfectly well," Hannah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I've decided that some prices are too high to pay." Regardless of the consequences, behind Morrison, she could see Nokoni Puha watching through the prison window, his expression unreadable but his posture alert. The presence of the Comanche warrior somehow gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. Morrison's carefully maintained facade of civility finally cracked completely. "You stupid girl, do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Food, shelter, protection, everything you need to survive on this godforsaken frontier. I understand exactly what I'm refusing," Hannah said firmly. "And I'd rather face honest hardship than dishonest comfort." The sutler's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Honest hardship? You'll be dead within a week. The Comanche will scalp you, the weather will freeze you, or the wolves will tear you apart. And for what? Some misguided notion of virtue?" What happened next shocked everyone present, including Morrison's own men. Losing all self-control, the sutler lunged forward and grabbed Hannah's wrist with brutal force, his fingers digging into her flesh like iron clamps. "You'll work for me whether you like it or not," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "I've invested too much time in this arrangement to let some high-minded little fool ruin my plans." Hannah struggled against his grip, but Morrison was stronger than his soft appearance suggested. "Let me go!" she cried out, trying to pull free. "Mr. Morrison, release the lady immediately," came a stern voice from behind them. Colonel Mackenzie had appeared around the corner of the building, flanked by 2 armed soldiers. The commanding officer's face was dark with disapproval as he took in the scene. Morrison reluctantly released Hannah's wrist, but didn't back down. "Colonel, this is a private business matter. The woman has contracted to work for me, and she's trying to renege on our agreement. What I witnessed was a man physically assaulting a woman who clearly didn't consent to his advances," Colonel Mackenzie replied coldly. "And on my post, no less." The colonel's intervention should have ended the confrontation, but Morrison had apparently crossed some internal line that prevented rational thinking. Instead of retreating gracefully, he turned toward Hannah with vicious intent. "If you won't work for me willingly, then perhaps a night in my store will change your perspective," he said, reaching for her again. "A woman alone needs to learn her place in the natural order of things." What happened next would be talked about around Fort Richardson for years afterward. The sound of splintering wood erupted from the prison window as Nokoni Puha drove his shoulder against the frame with explosive force. The bars, weakened by years of weather and poor maintenance, gave way with a screech of protesting metal in one fluid motion. The Comanche warrior rolled through the destroyed window and landed in a crouch between Morrison and Hannah. Despite days of captivity, he moved with the lethal grace of a mountain lion, every muscle coiled and ready for violence. "Step away from the woman," Nokoni Puha said in a voice that carried absolute authority. Morrison stumbled backward, his face going pale as he found himself confronting 6 feet of angry Comanche warrior at point-blank range. His 2 associates reached for their weapons, but froze when Colonel Mackenzie's soldiers raised their rifles. "Nobody move!" the colonel shouted. "Weapons down, all of you!" The tableau held for several heartbeats, Morrison and his men backing away from Nokoni Puha, the Comanche warrior standing protectively in front of Hannah, soldiers aiming rifles in multiple directions, and Colonel Mackenzie trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of hand. "Prisoner, return to your confinement immediately," Colonel Mackenzie ordered. Nokoni Puha straightened to his full height, but didn't move away from Hannah. "I claim right of protection under warrior law. This woman showed kindness to an enemy in captivity. Honor requires that I defend her from those who would do her harm." Colonel Mackenzie stared at Nokoni Puha in bewilderment. "Warrior law? This is United States territory, and you're a prisoner of war. You have no rights here, except what I choose to grant." "Then grant me the right to speak truth," Nokoni Puha replied calmly. "In my culture, when someone shows mercy to a captive enemy, they create a debt that transcends the boundaries between peoples. This debt can only be repaid through protection and service." Hannah found herself stepping forward, still clutching the eagle feather. "What are you saying?" Nokoni Puha turned to face her, his dark eyes serious but gentle. "I am saying that you showed me kindness when you had no obligation to do so. You accepted my gift when others would have spurned it. You listened to my words when others saw only an enemy." He gestured toward Morrison, who was still backing away with obvious terror. "This man would treat you as property to be bought and sold. But under Comanche law, you have earned the right to my protection and the protection of my people." Colonel Mackenzie looked like a man watching his orderly military world dissolve into chaos. "Are you suggesting some sort of adoption arrangement?" "Because I can assure you that's completely impossible under military regulations." "Not adoption," Nokoni Puha said quietly. "Marriage." The word dropped into the evening air like a thunderbolt. Hannah felt her knees go weak, while Morrison made a strangled noise of outrage. Even Colonel Mackenzie's professional composure cracked at this unprecedented development. "Marriage?" Hannah whispered. "But we barely know each other." In my tribe, marriage is often arranged to create alliances between families or to provide protection for women without male relatives. Nokoni Puha explained patiently. It is a practical arrangement that can grow into deeper feelings over time, but its primary purpose is mutual survival and support. Colonel Mackenzie found his voice first. This is absolutely preposterous. You're suggesting that an American citizen marry a Comanche warrior who's currently our prisoner. The very idea is perfectly legal under both American and tribal law, interrupted a new voice. Dr. Richardson had arrived on the scene, drawn by the commotion, and his expression showed professional fascination rather than shock. Doctor, surely you can't be serious, the colonel protested. Actually, I've made a study of intertribal marriage customs during my time on the frontier, Dr. Richardson replied. Many tribes, including the Comanche, recognize marriage ceremonies performed by captured individuals as binding under both tribal and territorial law. It's a survival mechanism that's evolved over centuries of conflict. Morrison finally found his voice. This is insane. You can't seriously be considering allowing a white woman to marry a savage. The words were barely out of his mouth before Nokoni Puha moved with lightning speed, covering the distance between them in 2 strides. His hand closed around Morrison's throat, not choking, but making the threat unmistakably clear. "Speak carefully about my intended wife," the Comanche warrior said in a voice like winter wind. "Your next words will determine whether you leave this place walking or carried." Hannah watched the confrontation with a mixture of terror and amazement. In the space of a few minutes, her world had completely transformed. From facing Morrison's degrading proposition, she now found herself protected by a man who was offering her a solution she never could have imagined. "I need time to think," Hannah said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Of course," Nokoni Puha replied, releasing Morrison and stepping back. "This is a decision that will shape both our destinies. It should not be made in haste or under pressure." Colonel Mackenzie seized the opportunity to restore some semblance of order. "Everyone will return to their quarters immediately while I sort out this mess. Nokoni Puha, you'll be confined under additional security. Miss Pierce, you'll remain in the chapel under guard until we can determine the legal ramifications of this situation." As the soldiers began dispersing the crowd, Dr. Richardson approached Hannah quietly. "Miss Pierce, I realize this must be overwhelming, but you should know that Nokoni Puha's offer represents a genuine solution to your predicament. Intercultural marriages are more common on the frontier than people generally acknowledge." "But what kind of life would it be?" Hannah asked desperately. "Living with people whose language I don't speak, whose customs I don't understand." "A life where you're treated with respect and dignity," Dr. Richardson replied. "From my observations, Comanche women enjoy considerably more freedom and social status than many of their white counterparts. They own property, participate in tribal decisions, and are valued for their intelligence as well as their domestic skills." The doctor paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I've also learned that Nokoni Puha is highly respected among his people. Marriage to him would place you under the protection of one of the most powerful warriors in the southern plains." As the immediate crisis subsided, Morrison regrouped with his associates near the sutler's store. Hannah could see them engaged in heated conversation, and something about their body language suggested that the evening's humiliation had only strengthened their resolve. Around midnight, Hannah was awakened in the chapel by the sound of shouting from the direction of the administrative building. Through the frosted window, she could see torchlight flickering and soldiers running toward what appeared to be a fire. Father O'Sullivan burst through the chapel door, his face grim with concern. "Miss Pierce, you need to come with me immediately. There's been an incident." Hannah threw on her coat and followed the priest outside. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Soldiers forming bucket brigades to fight a fire that had apparently started in the building where Nokoni Puha was being held. "What happened?" she asked breathlessly. "Someone set fire to the prison quarters," Father O'Sullivan replied grimly. "They managed to get Nokoni-Puha out safely, but the building is a total loss." Colonel Mackenzie appeared through the smoke, his uniform singed and his face black with soot. "The prisoner is secure, but we have reason to believe this was arson rather than an accident." Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Morrison," she whispered. "That's our suspicion as well," the colonel confirmed. "But proving it will be another matter entirely. Morrison and his men have alibis for the evening, and there were no witnesses to the fire's origin." The implications were clear and terrifying. Morrison had apparently decided that if he couldn't have Hannah, he would ensure that her alternative protector was eliminated. The attempted murder of a prisoner under military protection represented a level of desperation and viciousness that shocked even the hardened frontier soldiers. The fire changed everything for Hannah. Seeing the lengths to which Morrison would go to maintain control over her fate clarified her thinking in ways that hours of philosophical debate could not have accomplished. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of the prison building, she found Nokoni-Puha under guard near the quartermaster's supply shed. Despite the night's harrowing experience, he appeared calm and composed, though she noticed new rope burns on his wrists from where soldiers had dragged him to safety. "Are you hurt?" were her first words. "My body is unharmed," he replied, "but my spirit is troubled by the hatred that drove someone to attempt murder rather than accept a woman's right to choose her own path." Hannah looked into his dark eyes and saw something she had never expected to find: genuine concern for her welfare rather than possessive desire. "You could have been killed because of me. I could have been killed for many reasons," Nokoni-Puha said simply. "A warrior accepts such risks as part of life. But I am troubled that you might blame yourself for another man's evil actions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Mackenzie, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Miss Pierce, I need to discuss your situation with you. The fire has complicated matters considerably." "How so?" "Morrison is claiming that the fire was set by Comanche raiders attempting to free their war chief. He's demanding additional protection for civilians and suggesting that your association with Nokoni-Puha has made you a security risk." Hannah felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her. "What does that mean for me?" "No, it means that your options have become even more limited," the colonel replied wearily. "I can't provide indefinite sanctuary on military property, especially if there's a possibility of Indian attacks. And Morrison's influence with the territorial authorities means that finding alternative employment has become virtually impossible." That afternoon, Hannah sat beside the fort's well, turning the eagle feather over in her hands while considering her impossible situation. The fire had eliminated any doubt about Morrison's true nature, but it had also trapped her in circumstances that seemed to offer no honorable escape. Dr. Richardson joined her on the wooden bench, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a man who'd been thinking deeply about complex problems. "Miss Pierce, I've been researching the legal precedents for intercultural marriages on the frontier," he said without preamble. "The situation is more favorable than Colonel Mackenzie initially believed." "How so?" "Territorial law recognizes marriages performed according to tribal customs as legally binding, provided both parties consent freely. There are several documented cases of white women marrying into Indian tribes and maintaining full legal status under American law." Dr. Richardson opened his bag and withdrew a leather-bound book. "I've also been corresponding with Indian agents about Comanche cultural practices. What Nokoni-Puha described is accurate. Marriage in his tribe is often a practical arrangement designed to provide mutual protection and support." He paused, studying Hannah's face carefully. "But more importantly, I've been observing the character of the man making this proposal. In my professional opinion, Nokoni-Puha possesses moral qualities that would make him a better husband than many supposedly civilized white men." You really believe that? Miss Pierce, I've seen this man face death with dignity, show concern for his enemy's welfare, and risk his life to protect a woman he barely knows. Dr. Richardson replied firmly. Those are not the actions of a savage, but of a gentleman in the truest sense of the word. As the sun began to set on what felt like the longest day of her life, Hannah found herself once again at the window of Nokoni Puha's new prison, a reinforced storage building that had been hastily converted to hold him after the fire. "Have you reached your decision?" he asked quietly. Hannah looked at the eagle feather in her hand, then at the man who had given it to her. In his eyes, she saw patience, respect, and something that might grow into love given time and understanding. "If I agree to this marriage," she said carefully, "what would you expect from me?" "Honesty, loyalty, and the willingness to learn my people's ways," Nokoni Puha replied. "In return, I offer protection, respect, and a place of honor among the Comanche. Our marriage would be real, but it need not be rushed into intimacy. Such things develop naturally when two people learn to trust each other." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Hannah felt something settle in her chest. Not romantic love, but something deeper and more practical, the recognition of mutual respect and shared values. "Then yes," she said quietly, "I accept your proposal." Nokoni Puha's face lit up with what she could only describe as joy. "Then tomorrow, if your military leaders permit it, we will be married according to both Comanche and American law. And you will never again have to fear men like Morrison or face the wilderness alone." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Morrison appeared from the shadows near the building, his face twisted with rage and his hand resting on the butt of a revolver. "Over my dead body," he snarled. Morrison's hand trembled as he drew his revolver, the weapon gleaming dully in the torchlight from the fort's evening patrols. His face was a mask of rage and desperation, the carefully maintained facade of respectability finally stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "You think you can humiliate me in front of the entire fort?" Morrison snarled, his voice cracking with fury. "Choose some savage over a civilized white man? I'll see you both dead before I let that happen." Nokoni Puha moved with fluid grace, despite his confined space, positioning himself between Morrison and Hannah while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. His voice remained calm, but Hannah could see the coiled tension in his muscles. "Your quarrel is with me," Nokoni Puha said quietly. "The woman has made her choice freely. Honor that choice and walk away while you still can." Morrison's laugh was high and brittle. "Honor from a Comanche dog? You people wouldn't know honor if it scalped you. And you," he turned the gun toward Hannah, "you're nothing but a whore who'd rather spread her legs for a redskin than work honestly for a decent white man." The insult hung in the air like poison. Hannah felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, but before she could respond, the sound of running footsteps announced the arrival of Colonel Mackenzie and his guards. "Morrison, lower that weapon immediately," the colonel shouted, his own pistol already drawn. "You're threatening civilians on United States military property." But Morrison had passed beyond the reach of military authority or rational thought. "Civilians?" he spat. "She's a traitor to her own race, and he's a murdering savage. I'm doing this territory a favor by putting them both down." What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to stretch for hours, but probably lasted only minutes. Morrison kept his gun trained alternately on Hannah and Nokoni Puha, while Colonel Mackenzie's soldiers formed a cautious semicircle, their rifles ready but unable to fire without risking civilian casualties. "Mr. Morrison, think about what you're doing," Colonel Mackenzie said in his most authoritative voice. "You're a respected businessman with interests throughout this territory. Don't throw your life away over a personal disagreement. Respected." Morrison's voice cracked again. "I'll have no respect left if word spreads that I let some frontier slut choose an Indian over me." My reputation will be destroyed, my business partnerships ruined. Hannah found her voice at last. Your reputation is already destroyed, Mr. Morrison. Everyone at this fort has seen what kind of man you really are. No woman will ever feel safe working for you again. The truth of her words seemed to hit Morrison like a physical blow. His gun hand wavered, and for a moment Hannah thought he might surrender. Instead, his expression hardened into something cold and final. Then I have nothing left to lose, he whispered, raising the revolver toward Hannah's heart. The shot rang out across the fort like thunder, echoing off the wooden buildings and sending horses whinnying in their corrals. Hannah screamed and threw herself to the ground, expecting to feel the burning impact of a bullet. Instead, she heard Morrison cry out in pain and the metallic clatter of his gun hitting the ground. When she looked up, she saw Sergeant Kelly standing 20 feet away with a smoking rifle in his hands. Morrison was on his knees, clutching a wounded shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. "Sorry, Colonel," Sergeant Kelly said matter-of-factly. "Man was about to murder a lady. Couldn't let that happen." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Dr. Richardson treated Morrison's wound, while Colonel Mackenzie dealt with the legal and political ramifications of the shooting. Morrison would survive, but his shoulder would never fully heal, and his reputation in the territory was indeed destroyed beyond repair. More importantly for Hannah, the incident had clarified something crucial for Colonel Mackenzie. Faced with Morrison's attempted murder of civilians on military property, the commanding officer realized that unconventional solutions might be necessary to prevent further violence. "Miss Pierce," the colonel said as dawn broke over Fort Richardson, "I've been giving serious thought to your situation and Nokoni Puha's proposal. While I find the idea personally distasteful, I cannot deny that it represents the most practical solution to your predicament." Hannah felt a flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. "Are you saying you'll permit the marriage?" "I'm saying that I'll allow it to proceed under military oversight, provided certain conditions are met," Colonel Mackenzie replied carefully. "First, the ceremony must be performed according to both American and Comanche law to ensure its legal validity. Second, you must demonstrate that your consent is freely given and not the result of coercion or desperation." He paused, studying her face intently. "And third, you must understand that once this marriage takes place, you'll be leaving American civilization behind. Nokoni Puha's people live by their own laws and customs, which may be very different from what you're accustomed to." "I understand, Colonel, and I accept those conditions." The next few days were spent in intensive preparation for what would be Fort Richardson's first intercultural marriage ceremony. Dr. Richardson threw himself into researching Comanche wedding customs with the enthusiasm of a scholar, while Father O'Sullivan wrestled with the theological implications of blessing a union between a Christian woman and a man from what the church considered a pagan culture. "The fundamental question," Father O'Sullivan explained to Hannah during one of their many conversations, "is whether this marriage serves God's purpose of providing mutual support and protection, or whether it represents a compromise with forces that oppose Christian civilization." "And what conclusion have you reached, Father?" The elderly priest smiled sadly. "I've concluded that God's mercy is larger than my understanding, and that love and protection can flourish in circumstances I might never have imagined. If this union brings you safety and happiness, then perhaps it serves a divine purpose I'm not qualified to judge." Meanwhile, Nokoni Puha worked with tribal interpreters to explain the significance of Comanche marriage rituals to the fort's residents. Hannah was fascinated to learn that Comanche weddings were relatively simple affairs focused on the practical aspects of creating a new household rather than elaborate romantic ceremonies. "In my culture," Nokoni Puha explained during one of their supervised meetings, "marriage is viewed as the joining of two families rather than just two individuals. The bride's family provides horses and household goods, while the groom's family offers protection and hunting territories. But I have no family to provide horses," Hannah pointed out. "Just these seduces to the turn." "You have friends who have become like family," Nokoni Puha replied, gesturing toward the soldiers and civilians who had rallied to support her. "Their goodwill and blessings will serve the same purpose as horses and goods." Mrs. Brennan took charge of preparing Hannah for the wedding with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. The older woman had somehow acquired yards of white cloth and enlisted several other officers' wives in creating a dress that would be appropriate for both American and Comanche sensibilities. "The key," Mrs. Brennan explained while pinning fabric around Hannah's waist, "is to create something that honors both cultures without offending either. White for Christian purity, but cut in a style that allows for Comanche decorative elements." The decorative elements turned out to be beautiful beadwork provided by a Kiowa woman named Morning Star, who had been living near the fort after her own intertribal marriage to an army scout. Morning Star worked quietly and skillfully, adding intricate patterns to Hannah's dress while sharing stories about life in mixed-culture families. "The first year is always difficult," Morning Star admitted in her careful English. "You must learn new ways of cooking, speaking, even thinking. But if both husband and wife show patience and respect, the differences become strengths rather than problems." Hannah found these conversations invaluable as she prepared mentally for the dramatic change her life was about to undergo. The practical details of cross-cultural marriage were far more complex than the romantic stories suggested, requiring flexibility, humor, and constant willingness to learn. "What about children?" Hannah asked during one of these sessions. "How do mixed-culture children find their place in either world?" Morning Star smiled. "They create their own place, taking the best from both worlds and making something new. My son speaks 4 languages and can track deer like a Kiowa warrior or read books like a white scholar. The world needs such people to build bridges between different peoples." During his own preparation for the marriage, Nokoni Puha faced skepticism from some members of his own war party who had been captured along with him in earlier skirmishes. These men questioned whether marrying a white woman represented betrayal of Comanche values or practical adaptation to changing circumstances. "She is not like the other white women we have encountered," Nokoni Puha explained to his fellow warriors during one of their supervised conversations. "She shows respect for our customs, listens to our words with an open heart, and demonstrated courage when facing danger." The eldest of the captured warriors, a man named Bear Claw, who had fought alongside Nokoni Puha for 20 years, studied Hannah carefully during their few interactions before rendering his judgment. "This woman has warrior spirit," Bear Claw pronounced. "She chooses the difficult path rather than the easy one, shows loyalty to those who treat her with honor, and does not fear the unknown. She will make a good Comanche wife if she proves willing to learn our ways." This endorsement from respected elders carried significant weight with the other warriors, who began to view Hannah's presence as potentially beneficial rather than threatening to tribal integrity. Nokoni Puha also used this time to share more of his personal history with Hannah, helping her understand the man she was agreeing to marry. She learned that he had been married before, to a Comanche woman who died in a cavalry attack 3 years earlier, and that his name, Wandering Medicine, came from his reputation as both a formidable warrior and a skilled healer. "I do not expect you to replace my first wife in my heart," he told Hannah honestly. "That love belongs to the past. But I hope we can build something new together, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to each other's welfare." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with early November frost painting the prairie grass silver in the morning light. Word had spread throughout the territory, and the fort was crowded with visitors who had come to witness the unprecedented ceremony. Some came out of genuine curiosity about intercultural marriage, others hoping to see a spectacle, and a few clearly expecting the whole arrangement to collapse in dramatic fashion. Colonel Mackenzie had increased security around the fort, but the atmosphere was more festive than tense. Hannah woke before sunrise in the chapel, where she had spent her last night as a single woman, Mrs. Brennan and the other officers' wives arrived early to help with final preparations, chattering excitedly as they arranged her hair and made last-minute adjustments to her dress. "Oh, you look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Brennan said, stepping back to admire their work. "Nervous?" Terrified," Hannah admitted, "but also more hopeful than I've felt since my first husband died. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I know I'm making this choice freely and for the right reasons." Across the fort, Nokoni-Puha was undergoing his own preparations with the help of his fellow warriors. They had managed to create traditional Comanche wedding regalia using materials available at the fort, including a magnificent headdress decorated with eagle feathers that commanded respect from even the most skeptical observers. The actual wedding ceremony was a unique blend of American and Comanche traditions that reflected the complex cultural negotiations both parties had undergone. Father O'Sullivan began with Christian prayers and readings, emphasizing the sacramental nature of marriage as a union blessed by God for mutual support and protection. Hannah and Nokoni-Puha stood before the assembled crowd. Their hands joined, while Father O'Sullivan spoke about love, commitment, and the courage required to build a life together despite differences in background and culture. "Do you, Hannah Pierce, take this man to be your husband, promising to honor him according to both Christian and Comanche traditions, forsaking all others for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Hannah said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Do you, Nokoni-Puha, take this woman to be your wife, promising to protect and provide for her according to the ways of your people, forsaking all others for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Nokoni-Puha replied in English, then repeated the vow in Comanche for the benefit of his fellow warriors. The Christian portion of the ceremony concluded with Father O'Sullivan's blessing and the exchange of simple rings that had been crafted by the fort's blacksmith from silver coins. But the Comanche portion was just beginning. Bearclaw stepped forward to perform the traditional Comanche wedding ritual, which involved the sharing of water from the same cup to symbolize the joining of two lives into one stream. Hannah drank first, then passed the ceremonial cup to Nokoni-Puha, who drained it completely before breaking it against the ground to show that their union could not be undone. The most moving moment of the entire ceremony came when Nokoni-Puha removed the sacred eagle feather from his headdress and placed it gently in Hannah's hair. This was not a traditional Comanche wedding custom, but rather a personal gesture that acknowledged the role the feather had played in bringing them together. "This feather carried my prayers through many dark times," he said softly. His words translated for the assembled crowd. "Now it carries the prayers of both our peoples that our marriage will bring peace and understanding between our different worlds." Hannah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the significance of the moment overwhelmed her. 3 months ago, she had been a desperate widow facing starvation and degradation. Now she stood as the wife of a respected warrior, surrounded by people from two cultures who had come together to celebrate her choice and wish her well. Colonel Mackenzie stepped forward to complete the legal formalities, signing the marriage certificate that would make their union official under territorial law. His expression was still somewhat skeptical, but his words were generous. "By the authority vested in me by the United States Army and the Territory of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife according to the laws of both peoples. May your marriage bring peace and understanding to all who know you." The wedding feast that followed was a remarkable fusion of military, frontier, and Native American traditions. The fort's cooks had prepared their best attempts at traditional dishes, while Morning Star and the other tribal women contributed foods prepared according to their own customs. Soldiers mingled with warriors, officers' wives chatted with Native American women, and for a few hours, the artificial boundaries that usually separated these communities seemed to dissolve in the warmth of shared celebration. Hannah found herself the center of attention, receiving advice from married women of both cultures about how to build a successful partnership despite obvious challenges. The conversations were sometimes awkward due to language barriers, but the underlying goodwill was unmistakable. "Remember," Mrs. Brennan whispered during a quiet moment, "marriage is always a journey into unknown territory. The fact that yours crosses cultural boundaries just makes it more of an adventure." As evening fell and the celebration began to wind down, Hannah and Nokoni Puha found themselves standing together at the edge of the fort, looking out toward the prairie where their new life together would unfold. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to his people's winter camp, leaving behind the safety of military protection for the uncertainties of life among the Comanche. "Are you ready for this adventure?" Nokoni Puha asked gently. Hannah looked down at the eagle feather now woven into her hair, then at the man who had offered her not just survival, but dignity and hope for the future. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. The morning after the wedding dawned with crystalline clarity, the kind of Texas sky that stretched endlessly in all directions and made the horizon seem like the edge of the world. Hannah stood at the fort's main gate, her few possessions packed into leather saddlebags that Nokoni Puha had somehow acquired during their brief engagement. She wore practical riding clothes donated by the officers' wives, sturdy wool pants, leather boots, and a heavy coat lined with rabbit fur that Mrs. Brennan had insisted she take. The eagle feather remained woven into her hair, now accompanied by a small silver cross that Father O'Sullivan had blessed as a wedding gift. "The prisoner exchange has been finalized," Colonel Mackenzie announced formally, though his tone had warmed considerably since witnessing the wedding ceremony. "Nokoni Puha and his warriors are free to return to their people, with the understanding that Mrs. Pierce goes willingly as his lawful wife." Hannah still felt a thrill at hearing herself called Mrs. Pierce in this new context, not as the desperate widow she had been, but as a woman who had chosen her own destiny despite impossible circumstances. Nokoni Puha emerged from the fort, leading a magnificent painted horse, its coat a rich chestnut brown, decorated with white symbols that she was learning represented protection and safe journeys. He moved with the easy grace of a man returning to his natural element after too many days of confinement. "This is Windrunner," he said, stroking the horse's neck affectionately. "She was my first wife's favorite mount, but she has been waiting for a new rider who would appreciate her spirit." Hannah approached the horse cautiously, extending her hand for Windrunner to sniff. The mare's dark eyes seemed intelligent and knowing, as if she understood the significance of this moment. When Windrunner nuzzled her palm gently, Hannah felt it like a benediction. Hannah had ridden horses before, but only in the sedate manner considered appropriate for ladies in Missouri farming communities. Comanche riding, as she quickly discovered, was an entirely different art form that emphasized unity between horse and rider, rather than mere transportation. "Your people sit on horses like passengers in a wagon," Bearclaw observed, with good-natured criticism, as Hannah struggled to find her balance on Windrunner's back. "Comanche women ride like the horse is part of their own body, or brain." The first few hours of their journey were humbling for Hannah as she learned to adjust her seat, her grip, and her entire relationship with the animal beneath her. Windrunner was patient but demanding, requiring active participation rather than passive sitting. "Feel her breathing," Nokoni Puha instructed, riding alongside on his own horse, a powerful black stallion named Thunderwalker. "Match your rhythm to hers. When you move together, riding becomes like dancing." By midday, Hannah was beginning to understand what he meant. As her body learned to flow with Windrunner's gait, the jarring discomfort of the morning gave way to something approaching harmony. She could feel the mare's strength beneath her and sense the subtle communications that passed between them, through shifts in weight and pressure. The landscape around them gradually changed as they moved deeper into Comanche territory. The rolling hills and scattered settlements near Fort Richardson gave way to vast expanses of prairie grass that rippled like green ocean waves in the constant wind. Hannah had never seen country so open and seemingly endless, Around noon, they were joined by a dozen Comanche warriors who had been waiting at a predetermined rendezvous point, marked by a distinctive rock formation. Hannah's first sight of the full war party took her breath away. These were men who lived their entire lives in harmony with this harsh landscape, and it showed in every aspect of their bearing. Each warrior rode as if he had been born in the saddle, controlling his horse through subtle movements that were almost invisible to untrained eyes. Their weapons, a mixture of traditional bows and lances alongside captured rifles, were worn with the casual confidence of men who had never doubted their ability to protect themselves and their families. The leader of this group was a man called Strikes First, who appeared to be in his 40s and bore the scars of many battles. His initial assessment of Hannah was thorough and uncomfortably direct, studying her like a horse trader, evaluating potential breeding stock. "So this is the white woman who chose our brother over her own people," Strikes First said, in heavily accented English. "She looks soft. The prairie will either kill her or make her strong very quickly. She has already proven her strength by refusing to surrender her honor when faced with impossible choices," Nokoni-Puha replied firmly. "The prairie will teach her many things, but courage is not one of them. She already possesses that." The exchange established the tone for Hannah's integration into the group. She would be respected as Nokoni-Puha's wife and judged on her own merits, but she would receive no special consideration for her previous life or cultural background. If she could not adapt to Comanche ways, she would become a liability rather than an asset. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah began to understand the complex rhythm of Comanche travel. The war party moved with purposeful efficiency, covering ground at a steady pace while maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. Scouts ranged ahead and behind, watching for signs of other travelers, changes in weather, or the movement of buffalo herds. The warriors talked little during the ride, saving their energy for the physical demands of prairie travel. When they did speak, it was usually to share information about landmarks, water sources, or potential dangers rather than casual conversation. Hannah found herself studying their methods with the fascination of someone discovering an entirely new way of existing in the world. Every aspect of their equipment and behavior had been refined over generations to maximize survival in an environment that offered little margin for error. Their saddles were different from anything she had seen, simpler in construction, but perfectly adapted for warriors who might need to shoot arrows or swing weapons while riding at full speed. Their clothing was similarly practical, designed to provide protection from weather and thorns while allowing complete freedom of movement. "Watch how they read the land," Nokoni-Puha said during one of their brief rest stops. "Every ridge, every creek bed, every change in grass color tells a story about what has passed this way and when. Your people see empty wilderness. My people see a book written by wind and rain and the passage of countless animals." Hannah tried to apply this perspective to the landscape around them, but her eyes were not yet trained to interpret the subtle signs that seemed so obvious to her companions. It would take time and patient instruction to develop such skills. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossibly vivid after months of viewing the world through fort walls, the war party made camp in a sheltered valley beside a small creek. Hannah watched in fascination as the Comanche set up their temporary camp with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, they had established a defensive perimeter, secured the horses, and begun preparing the evening meal over a carefully concealed fire. "First rule of prairie camping," Bearclaw explained as he showed Hannah how to arrange her bedroll. "Never make yourself visible to enemies who might be watching from distant ridges. Fire goes in depression, sleeping areas behind natural barriers, horses positioned for quick escape if necessary." The evening meal was simple but nourishing. Dried meat, parched corn, and water flavored with wild herbs that one of the younger warriors had gathered during their afternoon ride. Hannah found the food strange but satisfying, and she was grateful for the hot coffee that Nokoni-Puha had somehow acquired before leaving the fort. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead, Hannah experienced something she had never encountered in her previous life: complete silence, broken only by natural sounds. No human voices from neighboring houses, no mechanical noises from mills or wagons, no domestic animals calling from nearby barns. The prairie night was alive with its own music: the whisper of wind through grass, the distant howl of wolves, the soft breathing of horses, and the subtle sounds of her companions preparing for sleep. For someone accustomed to the constant background noise of civilization, the experience was both peaceful and slightly unnerving. The next morning brought Hannah's first real test of cultural adaptation. She woke before dawn, as had become her habit during the desperate days before her marriage, and attempted to help with breakfast preparations, as she would have done in any civilized household. Her efforts to assist were met with surprised looks from the warriors and gentle but firm correction from Nokoni Puha. "Among my people, certain tasks belong to men and others to women," he explained quietly. "The division is not about superiority, but about efficiency and tradition." Hannah learned that cooking during travel was considered men's work because it required intimate knowledge of local plants, water sources, and methods for concealing smoke from potential enemies. Women certainly cooked in permanent camps, but trail cooking involved skills that took years to develop. "Watch and learn," Nokoni Puha advised. "When we reach our winter camp, there will be plenty of opportunities for you to contribute your skills. But for now, your job is to become strong in the saddle and observant of everything around us." The correction stung initially, as it reminded Hannah of how much she had to learn about her new life. But she gradually recognized the wisdom in the approach. Trying to help with unfamiliar tasks while still learning to ride properly would have exhausted her and potentially slowed the entire party. Instead, she focused on developing her riding skills and observing the complex interactions between her new companions. Each man had a distinct personality and role within the group, and understanding these relationships would be crucial for her future integration into Comanche society. The third day of their journey brought Hannah face to face with the wildlife that shared the vast prairie ecosystem. Just after sunrise, the war party crested a hill to find themselves looking down at a herd of buffalo stretching to the horizon. Thousands of dark shapes moving slowly across the grassland like a living river. Hannah had heard about buffalo all her life, but seeing them in such numbers was overwhelming. The sound of their movement was like distant thunder, and the earth seemed to vibrate beneath Windrunner's hooves as they passed within a quarter-mile of the herd. "Buffalo are the life of the prairie," Nokoni Puha explained as they watched the magnificent creatures. "They provide meat, hides for lodges and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings. When the white hunters kill them only for their tongues and leave the rest to rot, they are destroying the foundation of our entire way of life." The sight of the buffalo herd was followed by encounters with wolves, antelope, and prairie dogs, whose elaborate underground cities dotted the landscape. Each species had its own relationship with the Comanche, who understood the intricate web of predator and prey relationships that maintained the prairie's delicate balance. That evening, as they made camp near a grove of cottonwood trees, Hannah experienced her first prairie thunderstorm. The weather system approached from the west like an advancing army, with towering clouds that seemed to reach the sky itself and lightning that turned the entire landscape white for split seconds. "Prairie storms can kill the unprepared," Strikes First observed as they secured their equipment against the approaching wind. "But they also bring the water that makes all life possible. Like many things in this country, they must be respected rather than feared." During the quiet hours between travel days, Hannah began intensive lessons in Comanche language and customs under the patient tutelage of Nokoni Puha and the other warriors. The language proved challenging, with sounds and grammatical structures completely unlike anything in her previous experience. More complex were the social customs that governed relationships within the tribe. Comanche society operated according to rules that had been refined over centuries, and violations of these customs could have serious consequences for tribal harmony. In my culture, women have considerable power, but it is exercised differently than in your society, Nokoni Puha explained during one of their evening lessons. A Comanche woman owns her own property, chooses her own husband, and can divorce him if he proves unsatisfactory. But she also has specific responsibilities to her family and tribe that cannot be ignored. Anna learned that Comanche women were expected to be skilled in a wide range of practical arts: hide working, beadwork, food preparation, childcare, and the construction of lodges. They were also expected to be able to defend themselves and their children when necessary, as Comanche society was fundamentally organized around the concept of warriors and the families they protected. "Your education will continue when we reach our winter camp," Bearclaw promised. "The women there will teach you skills that no man can properly explain. But understanding the principles now will make your learning easier." As their journey continued, Hannah noticed subtle changes in the landscape that reflected their movement deeper into traditional Comanche territory. The grass grew shorter and tougher, adapted to irregular rainfall and constant wind. The trees became scarcer, clustered mainly around water sources that could support their growth. More significantly, the signs of white settlement gradually disappeared completely. No wagon ruts marked the earth, no fence posts dotted the horizon, no smoke from distant chimneys suggested human habitation. This was country that remained largely unchanged since the time of Hannah's great-grandparents. "This is how the world looked before your people came," Nokoni Puha said during one of their rest stops. "Not empty, as you were taught to believe, but full of life that followed its own patterns and seasons." Hannah was beginning to understand what he meant. Her eyes were learning to recognize the subtle signs of animal life that her companions read as easily as printed words: tracks in soft earth, disturbed grass where deer had bedded down, the flight patterns of birds that indicated water or danger. The vastness of the landscape was both exhilarating and humbling. She had grown up in a world where the horizon was defined by hills and trees, where human habitation was never more than a few miles away. Here she could ride for days without seeing any evidence of her own species, except for the small group that traveled with her. On the 7th day of their journey, Hannah noticed increased excitement among her companions as they recognized landmarks that indicated their approach to the tribal winter camp. Scouts rode ahead to announce their arrival, while the main party increased their pace despite the growing fatigue of both horses and riders. "Tonight, we will sleep in lodge instead of under stars," Strikes first announced with obvious satisfaction. "Tomorrow you will meet the women who will become your sisters and teachers." Hannah felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as they approached this next phase of her transformation. The journey across the prairie had been challenging but relatively simple. She had needed only to ride, observe, and learn basic survival skills. Life in a Comanche village would require much more complex cultural navigation. "Remember," Nokoni Puha said gently as the first smoke from lodge fires became visible on the horizon, "you are not expected to become Comanche overnight. But you are expected to show respect for our ways and willingness to learn what our people can teach you." As the sun set behind them, painting their shadows long across the prairie grass, Hannah caught her first glimpse of her new home, a collection of buffalo hide lodges arranged in careful order beside a creek that wound through a protected valley. Horses grazed in vast herds on the surrounding grassland, while children played between the lodges and women worked at tasks she could not yet identify. The eagle feather in her hair caught the evening wind as Windrunner carried her toward a life she could never have imagined during those desperate days at Fort Richardson. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Hannah knew she was arriving as a free woman who had chosen her own destiny rather than a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The Comanche winter camp spread before Hannah like a small city built from the earth itself, each buffalo hide lodge glowing golden in the firelight that danced within. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires, creating a welcoming haze that softened the stark beauty of the prairie landscape. The air carried the scents of roasting meat, tanned leather and sage burning in ceremonial fires. Children ran between the lodges, their laughter mixing with the sounds of horses nickering in the vast herds that dotted the surrounding grassland. Women moved with purposeful grace as they tended fires, prepared evening meals, and supervised the countless tasks required to maintain a community of nearly 300 people living in harmony with the harsh demands of frontier life. As their small party approached the camp's edge, Hannah noticed the careful organization underlying what might have appeared to outsiders as random placement of lodges. Each family group occupied a specific area based on clan relationships and social status, while the chief's lodge commanded a central position that allowed oversight of the entire community. "This is your home now," Nokoni-Puha said quietly as Windrunner carried Hannah toward a beautifully decorated lodge that stood among several others in what was clearly a place of honor. "Everything you see here, the people, the animals, the traditions, will become part of your life in ways you cannot yet imagine." Hannah's integration into Comanche society began immediately upon her arrival, as a group of women approached to welcome Nokoni-Puha's new wife. Leading them was an elderly woman, whose silver hair was braided with intricate beadwork and whose weathered face radiated both wisdom and authority. "This is Grandmother Moon," Nokoni-Puha said, using the English translation of her Comanche name. "She is the keeper of women's traditions and will guide your learning in the months ahead." Grandmother Moon studied Hannah with keen eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Her examination was thorough but not unkind, taking in everything from Hannah's posture in the saddle to the way she had woven the eagle feather into her hair. "She has good hands," Grandmother Moon announced after her inspection, speaking in Comanche but clearly intending for Hannah to understand through tone and gesture. "Strong back, clear eyes. She will learn what we can teach her." The other women gathered around Windrunner with curiosity and cautious welcome. Hannah recognized the mixture of skepticism and genuine interest in their faces. They wanted to know what kind of woman their respected warrior had chosen, and whether she would prove worthy of the honor he had bestowed upon her. "Come," said a younger woman whose English was accented but clear. "I am Prairie Flower, sister to Nokoni-Puha. You will stay in my lodge tonight while your own home is prepared." The next morning brought Hannah's first sight of the lodge that Nokoni-Puha had been constructing during the winter months before his capture at Fort Richardson. Located near the center of the camp in a position that reflected his status as a war chief. The structure was larger and more elaborate than she had expected. The framework consisted of specially selected poles that had been seasoned for months to ensure strength and flexibility in prairie winds. Over this skeleton, buffalo hides had been stretched and sewn with meticulous care, creating walls that would provide warmth in winter storms and coolness during summer heat. Inside, the lodge was arranged according to principles that balanced practical needs with spiritual significance. The fire pit occupied the center with carefully placed rocks that would radiate heat efficiently throughout the space. Sleeping areas were defined by colorful blankets and backrests made from willow branches, while storage areas held weapons, clothing, and the accumulated wealth of a successful warrior. "This is beautiful," Hannah whispered, running her fingers along the intricate beadwork that decorated the interior walls. "A home is more than shelter," Nokoni-Puha replied, watching her explore their new shared space. "It is a reflection of the people who live within it. This lodge will become beautiful as you add your own skills and vision to what I have begun." The walls already displayed evidence of Nokoni-Puha's achievements as a warrior. Painted symbols that recorded successful raids, ceremonial weapons that had been inherited from his father, and medicine bundles whose contents held spiritual significance that Hannah was not yet ready to understand. Hannah's education in Comanche domestic arts began immediately under the patient guidance of Grandmother Moon and the other women of the tribe. The complexity of skills required for successful prairie life was far greater than anything she had imagined during her sheltered existence in Missouri farming communities. Her first lessons focused on food preparation, which involved not only cooking techniques, but also detailed knowledge of wild plants, meat preservation, and the seasonal rhythms that governed when different resources would be available. Comanche women were expected to transform raw buffalo into dozens of different products that would sustain their families through harsh winters. Every part of buffalo has purpose, Prairie Flower explained as she demonstrated the process of preparing pemmican, the concentrated mixture of meat, fat, and berries that could sustain warriors during long hunting expeditions. Meat for eating, hide for lodges and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for thread, even dung for fuel when wood is scarce. Hannah watched in fascination as the women worked with tools and techniques that had been refined over countless generations. Their efficiency was remarkable. No motion was wasted, no resource overlooked, no opportunity for improvement ignored. More challenging than the physical skills were the social complexities of tribal life. Hannah had to learn not only what to do, but when and how and in whose company each task should be performed. Comanche society operated according to intricate protocols that governed relationships between different age groups, family clans, and social ranks. As the weeks passed, Hannah began to find her place within the rhythms of Comanche life. Her hands, already skilled from years of frontier living, adapted quickly to new tools and techniques. More importantly, her willingness to learn and her respectful attitude toward tribal customs earned gradual acceptance from women who had initially viewed her with suspicion. The breakthrough came during her first attempt at hide tanning, one of the most crucial skills for any Comanche woman. The process was physically demanding and required precise timing, but Hannah approached it with the same methodical determination that had helped her survive her desperate circumstances at Fort Richardson. "She learns like Comanche girl," Grandmother Moon observed approvingly as Hannah successfully completed her first buffalo hide. Not trying to change our ways to fit her old life, but changing herself to fit new life. With growing confidence came deeper friendships with the women who had become her teachers and companions. Hannah discovered that beneath the cultural differences lay universal human experiences, the challenges of marriage, the joys and sorrows of family life, the satisfaction of mastering difficult skills. Prairie Flower became particularly close, serving as both sister-in-law and cultural interpreter when language barriers threatened to create misunderstandings. Through their conversations, Hannah learned about Nokoni Puha's first marriage, his reputation within the tribe, and the expectations that came with being wife to such a prominent warrior. As winter deepened and Hannah's skills developed, the lodge she shared with Nokoni Puha began to reflect the blending of two cultural traditions. Her needlework skills, learned in Missouri but adapted to Comanche materials and designs, added new elements to the interior decoration. She created cushions stuffed with prairie grass and covered with hide, decorated in patterns that combined European geometric designs with traditional Comanche symbols. Her contribution to their shared home was subtle but significant, representing the gradual merging of two worlds into something entirely new. "You have made this place more beautiful," Nokoni Puha said one evening as they sat beside their fire, sharing the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the months of their marriage. "But more than that, you have made it truly home." Hannah felt the truth of his words in her bones. The lodge had become more than shelter. It was a place where she belonged, where her contributions were valued, where she could build a future based on mutual respect rather than desperate survival. The eagle feather that had brought them together now occupied a place of honor above their sleeping area. surrounded by other sacred objects that represented their shared commitment to building something lasting together. It had become a symbol not just of their initial connection, but of the courage required to create love across the boundaries that others insisted were impossible to cross. As spring approached and the tribe prepared for the seasonal migration to summer hunting grounds, Hannah reflected on the transformation that had taken place not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of what it meant to be strong. At Fort Richardson, she had believed that strength meant enduring whatever circumstances others imposed upon her. Among the Comanche, she had learned that true strength meant actively shaping those circumstances through skill, wisdom, and the courage to embrace change rather than merely survive it. She had sold herself for warmth and safety during that desperate winter. But the Comanche had given her something far more valuable, a place in the world where she could contribute her talents, share in community life, and build something meaningful that would outlast the hardships that had brought her to this point. The feather in her hair caught the morning breeze as she mounted Windrunner for another day's journey across the endless prairie. But now she rode not as a desperate refugee seeking shelter, but as a Comanche woman, traveling with her people toward whatever adventures the future might hold. Behind them, the winter camp dissolved into memory as the Great Migration began, carrying Hannah forward into a life she had never imagined but had learned to embrace with courage, wisdom, and hope. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.